Yeah, we are switching space or words, so I will tell you about logical models, and this is the discrete word. So the logical modeling is well adapted to tackle this type of questions where you have a signaling and regulatory networks driving the response of a cell from the external signals to compute, let's say, or to decide about a cellular response. So this type of question is well tackled by logical modeling, and I will use along this presentation a model published by Laurence Calzone and colleagues dealing with this type of phenomena, where you have here the death receptors, the intracellular signaling networks, and then the decision of the cell fate between survival and the two different types of death, apoptosis and non-apoptotic cell death, which is mainly the necrotic cell death. So very basics on logical models. You have an influence network here with your components generally associated with Boolean variables, and this is mainly the case we will consider here, meaning my components in the regulatory networks are considered on or off, active or inactive. And then you have the regulatory interactions with their signs, which denote the influence between the components. Sorry. Then beyond sorry. I don't have the pointer, sorry. So we have the regulatory structure, sorry, the network here. And then we have to define how this influence indeed take place, or in other words, the logical regulatory functions. These define the evolution of each component depending on the state of the regulators. So for example, in my network, if I consider the specific component ROS, it is inhibited by NF-kappa-B, so the rule to activate ROS is the absence of NF-kappa-B and the presence of one of its activators. Having set the model with the structure and the logical rule, we can then define the discrete dynamics of these models, which is generally represented by a state transition graph, which is defined by this transformation. For each component, we have the regulatory function, which drives the dynamics of each component. So we have the transition function defined over the state space. And for example, here in a toy model, if the state 0, 0, 0, where all my three components are off, if the target state is 1, 1, 1, so meaning each component has to be activated, the first possibility would be to update all the components synchronously. And this will give rise to the definition of this transverse or diagonal transition. Now we often consider the asynchronous behavior or update, where we update asynchronously or independently each component. So this may seem more reasonable because it does not assume anything about the delays. I am driving here all the possible transition and the concurrency inherent of these processes. So meaning from this synchronous dynamics, which is completely deterministic, I'm defining here a non-deterministic behavior where from this state I may increase one of the component, and this is kind of a race, and if we don't know, if we have no information about the delays, I will consider all potential trajectories of the system. So then the properties of interest are, what are the attractors? If we understand the attractors are as the phenotypes, for example, or the decisions of the cell upon some external signal, these are the long-term behaviors. In terms of state transition graph, these are the trap set of states. which are either stable state, point attractors, or cyclical behavior. One thing is to identify the attractor, the other is to analyze their reachability properties. So from initial condition, for example, what is the possibility, or what are the possibility to reach one or the other attractors, or do we have alternate transitions that lead to one and the other attractors? So in the asynchronous setup, we have the notion of strong basins of attraction, which are indeed these blue states, for example, will ultimately lead to the stable state. There is no other trajectories leading to other attractor. But we have also the notion of weak basins, because we have concurrent trajectories that might lead to different attractor, which is the case of this pink state. Note that in this synchronous behavior, because it is deterministic, we don't have this notion of weak basin of attraction, so every state will lead ultimately to a unique attractor. And here are my two states which were able to reach the stable state are now in the basin of the cyclical attractor. So things are really different depending on the updating mode. So going back to our example, if I want to assess the basins of attraction of my three phenotypes of survival and death, the problem with these larger networks is the combinatorial explosion. So here I reduced the model just to be able to construct explicitly the state transition graph. Here we have the state transition graph in this synchronous update with the separate and completely disconnected basins of attraction. And for example, we can see that the survival stable state has a very small basin of attraction. We can see also the appearance of a new cyclical attractor where the cell seems not to be able to decide. And this is the counterpart in the asynchronous behavior. So we have exactly the same number of states, but the number of transitions now, because we have concurrent transitions, is increased by tenfold. We lose now this spurious cyclical attractor. We have only the three expected phenotypes, but it's very difficult here to assess the basins of attraction. So this was our motivation. How could we assess the basins of attraction of our attractors here or phenotypes? So one thing which would be possible in this case, for example, if I am able to construct the state transition graph explicitly, is the brute force, sample the state space and see and verify the reachability property from each state. This is not very clever, so we will trying to imagine another method. So if I know the attractor, and if I could start with from the attractors and visit the reachability space in the reverse dynamics, then this would be much more efficient. So at least I would be able from each attractor to identify the weak basin of attraction of this attractor. The strong basins could be then retrieved just by performing set differences. So the question here is, can we define a model that would give rise to the reverse dynamic? I don't want to take the state transition graph and reverse, because this would be the brute force method, but I want a model that defines the reverse dynamics. And indeed, in the Boolean setting, so there is a way to define the transformation or the transition function for a new model from the original model, which is basically defined as the negation of the transformation in neighboring states. So for example, if I take a component GI here, so let's say that G3, and I want to define this new transition, which is the reverse of the black one, I will take the image of this one, so the neighboring state, and negate it. So it's a bit technical, but we can discuss later on. And we can prove formally that this FR, so this new transformation, indeed defines a state transition graph, which is exactly the reverse state transition graph of my original model. So then we can define, or we can check several properties of this reverse model, and in particular it's interesting to see that the regulatory structure is conserved up to the sign. So the auto-regulation and the dual regulation are maintained, but activation here are modified and become inhibition. If you think a bit, it's quite natural. So going back to our illustration, here is the Venn diagram describing the structure of the whole state transition graph, or the whole dynamics, for the full model. So here I didn't reduce, so meaning I have 25 evolving components. All my inputs are on, meaning it's the situation where the cell death receptors are activated. And we can then assess the structure. For example, the fact that 24% of the states, this is the intersection of all the basins of attraction, no decision is made already. All states in this region can lead to one of the three attractors, or to the three attractors. Then we can make a decision, so the system will, from this common region, will end up either in the strict basin of attraction of survival, or in this weak basin of attraction, which is common to the two types of death. And then only the decision between the type of death, apoptosis or necrosis, will be taken. Then we can be a bit more precise and assess the boundary of these strict basins of attraction in terms of direct transitions going into the basins or leading to the basins. So the question of assessing the basins of attractions of different phenotypes is often studied to understand what type of perturbation, model perturbation, can be used to modify or to reshape the basins of attraction. So here we perform this analysis, and we can see, for example, that RIP1 silencing leads to a complete loss of the survival phenotype and reshape the equilibrium between the apoptosis and the necrosis. So on multi-valued models, it's often useful to distinguish different functional levels. Unfortunately, multi-leveled models are not directly reversible, so we cannot perform this operation directly, but we can use the Booleanization of a model to then use the reverse Boolean model and assess the basins of attraction in the multi-valued models. So to conclude, I hope I convince you, or I illustrate the fact that logical models allow to assess qualitatively very important properties in terms of the propensity of the system to acquire, or of the cell to acquire one or another phenotype. The fact that we can provide a new model which defines exactly the reverse dynamics, and this is very useful to assess the basins of attraction in asynchronous dynamics. The fact that model perturbations then can be studied and their impact in reshaping the basins of attraction, and this is often understood as identifying drug targets, for example, just to reduce a basin of attraction rather than completely deleting a phenotype. Also, I discussed the synchronous dynamics because I think it's important to realize that the choice of the updating mode is really important and may completely change the shape of your dynamics over the state space. And this method has been implemented as a workflow using basically two tools, so GenSim for the modeling and the export towards Boolsim. Boolsim is a very powerful tool for Boolean networks to explore very large state space. And I have a poster, so you're welcome to visit me this afternoon if you want further details. So I thank the organizer for the opportunity to present this work, my co-authors, and my group at IGC, and also the supporting financial. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Thank you for your talk. So would you have a limit? I have two questions. Do you have a limit in the number of nodes that you need to have in a model for the method to be efficient?
So now I'm trying. So I don't have a way to really tell you, because it will depend also on the structure of the dynamics. So let's say you have a linear pathway, then you have no limit, basically. But now I am trying to use the method for a model of TH differentiation with over 18 nodes, and it's working.
Okay, and the second question was, so in the intermediate areas, does it mean that you can consider that as some kind of bifurcation decision? I mean, a decision where
exactly.
that the cell makes.
So this region, everything is possible. So in these states, there are trajectories. So if I start from this region, I have a trajectory towards survival, non-apoptotic cell death, and apoptosis. If I am in this region, the pink one, which is common between these two strict or basins of attraction, then I have still the choice of the type of death. So this structure is really peculiar to this model, because we could have also, so we don't have any intersection between the survival and one specific death, for example.
So it's a nice idea to reverse the dynamics, but I had just thought, like, does it make sense to combine the normal forward dynamics with the reverse dynamics, you know, for the efficiency reasons?
So maybe the first step we wanted to make here was to define a model. So we forget about the dynamics for a while, and we define a model which performs exactly the reverse dynamics. But then you're right, maybe to better explore the dynamics in a specific region, for example, we may combine both behavior. That's a very good point, yes.
Have you tried that? Have you tried that?
No, not yet.
Last question.
Okay. Thank you for your interesting talk. I was wondering, because you phrased the problem in terms of the language of concurrency, so synchronous, asynchronous. Is there a connection, or do you know if there's a connection between the problems you're studying and the problems studied in other concurrent systems, say deadlock or live lock and stuff like that?
So indeed, it's very related to all the field of discrete dynamics, Petri nets or cellular automata, for example. So here in general in this field, we consider these two dynamics, purely synchronous or purely asynchronous, meaning we update only one variable at a time. And so we are also, we try to keep aware of what is done in the field of concurrency, because, for example, people would consider what they call fully asynchronous, where you would consider all possible combination, for example. But all the tools that are used in this field indeed are applicable in Boolean or logical models in general. Yes. Now the specific questions or properties are often different. But yes, for example, I think about model checking, which is used in this field of logical models, which comes from this field of yeah. concurrency.
Okay, thank you, Claudine.
Thank you.